verses 28 to 32, it says, "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God or consider him worth knowing as their creator, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do things which are improper and repulsive until they were filled, permeated, and saturated with every kind of unrighteousness and wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, and mean-spiritedness, mean-spiritedness, and they are gossips, spreading rumors, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of new forms of evil, disobedient and disrespectful to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving and merciful, without pity, although they knew God's righteous decree and his judgment that those who do such things deserve death, yet they not only do them, but they even enthusiastically approve and tolerate those who practice them." And I'm going to jump to Deuteronomy 32 and 47. It says, "For it is not an empty or trivial matter for you. Indeed, it is your very life. By honoring and obeying this word, you will live long in the land which you are crossing the Jordan to possess." Now, even as we have been talking about school and some of the things we didn't like back then, but right now that we are adults, we can actually see, that was good for me. We also can relate that spiritually, because there are certain things, laws that God has placed in his word and told us, this is the way that I would want you to live. And it would be very sorrowful if we think that we know better than God. Now, several years ago when Malachi was small, of course, when they start Kutamba, he would want to go everywhere. So I put guardrails of what we call safety gates in certain places so that he could not access those places. Not because I hated him, but because I wanted him to be safe. And I believe that God's laws are safety gates. They are meant to protect us. But how many of us, like 2-year-olds, throw tantrums because God has placed a law? And I'm not saying I've never thrown a tantrum. Yeah, because you want to do a particular thing and God is saying, no. Because he's telling us in not so many words, I've put a safety gate for your safety because I love you. So today's devotion is entitled, God's Laws Are Safety Gates. And of course, we've read from those 2 chapters. I'm just going to mention several things because I do not have a lot of time. The first thing is that God's laws are protective rather than restrictive. As we have seen in Romans 1, 28 to 32, it illustrates what happens when people disobey God's boundaries. Their thoughts become warped and they start acting destructively. God's laws are acts of love and wisdom rather than dominance. He sees threats that we are not yet aware of. You know that saying that an old man, when he's seated, he can see far than someone who is young and is on a tree. In reality, what appears to be denied freedom is preserved life. So as back then, a lot of rules in our schools, they prepared us for life. They taught us to respect authority. They taught us to, to be people who can actually keep a job, amongst many other things. So God's laws are protective rather than restrictive. If you see a law that God is telling you, if God tells you don't do this, there's a 10 commandments, there's other things that God will tell you personally, don't do this. He is telling you, this is my boundary. If you cross it, umepita mpaka. You're no longer safe. The second thing is that covetousness shows why boundaries are important. The reason why God places restrictions on desire especially is demonstrated by covetousness. Although desire is a gift from God, it turns destructive when it goes beyond God's bounds. According to Romans chapter 1, people are given over to disordered desires when they reject God's truth. I didn't read the entire chapter of of Romans chapter 8, of course, verse 24 saying, therefore God gave them over in the lust of their own hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, abandoning them to the degrading power of sin, because by choice they exchanged the truth of God by a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. And of course, God goes ahead to say that verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading and vile passions, for their women exchanged the natural function of that for that which is natural, a function contrary to nature. So in other words, this is also pointing to homosexuality, telling us that your desire, if it's not within the boundaries that God has given us laws, then it's destructive. Actually, God talks about here in Romans chapter 1, saying that he finds it, I think it's in Leviticus, he finds it detestable. And that's not to say that the other sins like stealing and all those things, they are bad. God is telling us within these boundaries, you can be able to live a long life. We know, I was telling somebody, I believe that even when it comes to things like stealing, sexual immorality, covetousness, when you cross that boundary, it's like there are spirits that come to help you. Because how does a thief find out things? Yani umeficha pesa yako kwa bag somewhere, nobody knows, you are in a room alone. How do they know? So God is telling us that boundaries are important. God's command against covetousness and any other sin serves as a guardrail, a safety gate for the heart, keeping us safe from comparison, greed, exploitation, dissatisfaction. The rule is not just against joy, but against self-destruction. Disobedience begins with distrusting God's wisdom. So we think we know better. You remember what the devil told Eve? Did God really say? It's a subtle lie. When we reject God's sovereignty, we distort his commands to justify our desires. This is an exact pattern found in Romans chapter 1. Truth is exchanged for a lie. Right now, that is happening. People will even call you names and tell you you're being intolerant for simply stating what God has said. God's rule requires trust before understanding. Just as a son must trust his or her parents, believers must trust God's wisdom before even obedience appears. We must trust God, because if we don't, then obedience will look very costly. God's rules, they teach stewardship, contentment, and generosity. Robbing God and misusing what was intended for others demonstrates how covetousness corrupts stewardship. When we follow God's rules, we become content rather than competitive, generous rather than hoarders, secure rather than anxious. Can you tell how people are anxious these days? There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of stress and depression. But when you obey God, we become secure. These are fruits of protection and not restriction. And of course, finally, maturity means learning to appreciate the gates. Children eventually come to understand why boundaries exist. Spiritual maturity is also identical. Many Christians struggle because we seek freedom without training. However, God's rules are intended to train us in wisdom, safety, and joy. Psalm 19:11 says, in keeping them, there is a great reward. So even as we were talking about school and some of the things that we do not like, as we start the year, there are some things that God is going to tell you, I don't like that. It may not even be in the Bible, but your spirit knows God doesn't like it. And he's saying, my boundaries are for your safety. We go for a very brief break. We'll be back in a short while.
Raise your voice and shout. Come on.